Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Our first story takes us to a factory that worked like a well-oiled machine until upper management decided to optimize it. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. How one worker silenced an entire factory. At one of the factories I worked at, we used to have a real smooth system for shift changes. Each shift was technically 9 hours long, but only 8.5 were paid. The extra half-hour overlap was unpaid, but it was essential. It allowed us to communicate properly between shifts. You'd clock in, grab a coffee, and spend that 30 minutes talking to the outgoing shift about which machines were running fine, which ones were acting up, what materials we were short on, and whether maintenance had been called for any issues. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the operation running efficiently. The handover meant that when your shift actually started, you were ready to go. No downtime, no confusion. Then one day, some genius from corporate, the type who's never set foot on the production floor but loves spreadsheets, decided that the handover period was a waste of money. They did some math on paper, figured out how much they'd save by cutting it, and sent out a memo that read something like, "Effective immediately, the 30-minute overlap period between shifts will be eliminated. The lead men will be responsible for communicating all necessary information to the incoming shift. This will increase efficiency and reduce unnecessary labor costs." It didn't take a genius to see what would happen next. The lead men already had their hands full running the floor. There were too many machines, too many operators, and too much detail for one person to handle. But orders were orders. So when the new schedule kicked in, I showed up exactly at my new start time, not a minute earlier, walked straight onto the production floor at 7 o'clock sharp, hard hat on, lunchbox in hand, ready to clock in. Except nothing was running. Every single machine was down. The operators from the previous shift were standing around waiting because the outgoing crew had already clocked out and no one had passed on any instructions. The lead man looked like he was about to have a stroke trying to coordinate everything himself. He stormed up to me the moment he saw me. "Why didn't you come in early?" he barked. I smiled and said, "Because my shift starts at 7. I don't work for free." You could practically hear the gears turning in his head, and not the machine kind. He tried to argue, but what could he say? We were only doing what corporate told us to do. Naturally, my little act of compliance spread like wildfire. Every other setup operator and machinist decided they weren't coming in early either. If the company didn't want to pay for the handover, fine. They'd get exactly what they paid for. Within a few days, the factory's production dropped off a cliff. The first half hour of every shift became a dead zone. Machines sat idle, operators stood around waiting for instructions, and the lead men scrambled to figure out what was running, what wasn't, and which tools or materials were needed. By the end of the week, management was furious. Meetings were held, charts were made, blame was passed around like a hot potato. Eventually, someone figured out that this all started when one troublemaker, that'd be me, decided to stop coming in early. They pulled me into the office for a chat. The plant manager asked why I was setting a bad example. I said perfectly calmly, "I'm following the schedule you gave me. My shift starts at 7, and I start at 7. If you want us here earlier, pay us for that time." He didn't have much to say after that. You could tell he knew I was right, he just didn't like hearing it out loud. A few days later, we all got another memo. After reviewing production efficiency, management has decided to reinstate the 30-minute overlap period between shifts to ensure operational continuity. In other words, we screwed up, please go back to doing what worked. And just like that, everything went back to normal. Machines ran smoothly, communication improved, and production numbers bounced right back up. Corporate never admitted they were wrong, of course. They just quietly changed the policy and pretended it was their idea all along. But every time I saw one of those bean counters visit the plant after that, I couldn't help but smile. Because for once, the numbers told the truth. You can't save money by cutting corners on people who actually keep the place running. These people really thought cutting a 30-minute overlap wouldn't matter. As if production lines run on good vibes. You gave them exactly what they wanted, and the result? Silence, chaos, and idle machines. The best part is that the fix came disguised as a review. And our second story. A fence, a Karen, and a whole lot of nonsense. When I bought my house, the backyard was completely open. No fence, no barrier, just an empty stretch of grass that bled into the neighbors' yards. That was fine for some people, but I had dogs. big, energetic dogs who thought stay in the yard was more of a suggestion than a command. So naturally, one of my first priorities was putting up a proper fence. Being the reasonable neighbor I try to be, I went to both of the adjoining properties to see if they wanted to split the cost since the fence would benefit all of us. Both declined politely but firmly. "We don't need one said. "We like things open." The other, an older woman named Dorothy, simply said, "I'm not paying for something I didn't ask for." Fair enough. So I paid for it myself. Before any construction began, I did everything by the book. I hired a surveyor to clearly mark the property lines, and I had the fence installed a few inches inside my side of the boundary, just to avoid any future disputes. The contractor started with a cedar fence on the side facing Dorothy's yard, and everything was going smoothly until she decided it wasn't. One afternoon, as the workers were nearly done with that side, Dorothy marched over. I could tell by her expression that this wasn't going to be a friendly, nice day for yard work, Chad. "There's a problem with the fence," she announced flatly. I turned to look at it, puzzled. "What kind of problem?" "They're building it wrong," she said, crossing her arms. I frowned. The fence looked perfectly fine. Posts straight, boards even, clean lines. "Wrong in what way?" I asked. "They built it with the ugly side facing my yard." It took me a moment to realize what she meant. The horizontal rails which support the vertical boards were visible from her side. Apparently that offended her. "They can't build it like that," she said, her voice sharp. "That's against the law." Now, I'll admit that got my attention. I'd done plenty of homework before starting the project, but I hadn't heard anything about a fence law requiring one side to face a certain way. Still, her tone had just enough confidence to make me second-guess myself. "Against the law," I said carefully. "I guess I'll have to check with the city about that." Dorothy hesitated, clearly not expecting that response. Her face twitched with irritation. "Well, I don't know if it's a law, she admitted. Ah, there it was, the classic backpedal. "But it needs to be built with the ugly side facing your property," she continued. "That's just how it's done." I raised an eyebrow. "So you want me to pay to have them tear it down and rebuild it the other way?" "Yes," she said, completely serious. "It's not allowed to be the way it is." I took a deep breath and managed to keep my tone even. "I don't know if I can do that, but I'd be happy to have the fence guy make it a double-sided fence so it looks the same on both sides, if you'd like to pay for that." Her mouth fell open. "Me pay for it? I can't do that." I shrugged. "Then I guess I'll check with the city and do whatever the rules say." Sound fair? Dorothy didn't like that answer one bit. She gave me a tight-lipped glare that could curdle milk and stomped off without another word. I did check with the city later that day just to be absolutely sure, and as expected, there was no rule, ordinance, or law dictating which side of the fence had to face where. It was 100% up to the property owner. When I saw Dorothy the next morning, she pretended I didn't exist. She never brought up the fence again, though she made sure to scowl every time she passed it. I wish I could say that was the end of our troubles, but that was only the beginning of what turned into a long and rocky neighborly relationship. The ugly side of the fence was just her opening act, one that gave me a pretty good preview of how dramatic things would get living next to Dorothy. Sometimes people don't really want harmony, they want control. Dorothy wasn't upset about the fence, she was upset about not being consulted in a way that made her feel important. You offered her every chance to participate, you asked about splitting the cost, stayed within the boundary, and followed every regulation. That's how responsible property ownership is supposed to work. But because she didn't get a say in the aesthetic, she tried to rewrite the rules. And our last story. Landlord stealing my electricity plus gas. I'd been living in the upstairs unit of a small triplex for about 3 years. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, close to work, and the rent wasn't terrible. Every winter, my gas bill went through the roof. I'm talking $300 a month in the colder months, which made no sense for a one-bedroom apartment. The place wasn't exactly energy efficient, but it wasn't a leaky old cabin either. My electric bill wasn't much better, sitting at around $150 every month. I used LED bulbs, unplugged devices, did everything right, yet the bill stayed sky high. For years, I just figured it was Portland prices and an old building. Then last December, while doing laundry in the shared basement, I noticed something odd. There was a large vent pipe running from my furnace, the one I paid for, directly into the basement. I followed it and realized it was an open cutout in the ductwork. Warm air from my gas heater was pouring straight into the basement, heating the entire lower level like it was a spa. Didn't take long for the pieces to click. I turned the heat up in my apartment, waited a few minutes, then went back downstairs. Sure enough, the basement was even warmer. That was my first clue. The second came when I noticed the laundry machines humming away even when no one was using them. I traced the wires back to an electrical junction box. The line feeding them wasn't from a shared meter, it was from my breaker box. My heart dropped. My landlord, let's call her Martha, was literally stealing utilities from my unit to power and heat the shared spaces of her property. I started investigating. I spent a whole weekend going through every breaker in my panel. Most were fine, but one caught my eye, labeled GFI fault. When I flipped it off, the basement lights and laundry machines died instantly. That's when I got angry. I pulled my last 36 months of bills and did the math. If my gas and electric usage were what they should have been for a unit my size, I'd been overpaying by around $4,500 over the 3 years I'd lived there. And that was a conservative estimate. I double-checked my lease, not a single word about paying for shared area utilities, nothing about the basement, laundry, or exterior lighting. This was straight-up theft. So I hired a licensed HVAC tech to assess the furnace. He confirmed that roughly 70 to 75% of the heated air was being vented into the basement. He wrote up an official report for me. Next, I took photos and videos, everything labeled and time-stamped, and called the utility company. They confirmed the setup didn't look right, but said it was a civil matter since the account was in my name. Fine, I thought. Civil matter it is. I sent Martha a certified letter detailing everything, the power theft, the furnace modification, the overcharges, and a request for repayment. I included copies of the bills, the HVAC report, and a breakdown of estimated costs for electricity and gas used by her shared areas. 2 weeks later, she called me. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she snapped. "The utilities are shared for the property. It's always been that way." "Then you should have put that in the lease," I said. "You didn't, and I have proof you illegally diverted utilities." She hung up on me. A few days later, I got a text saying she wouldn't be renewing my lease due to upcoming renovations. Cute. I filed a small claims suit for theft of utilities, breach of contract, and constructive fraud. She tried to counterclaim that I was damaging her reputation and had tampered with electrical systems. The judge wasn't buying it. When my HVAC tech testified that the furnace had been deliberately modified to heat the basement, Martha tried to argue that the hole in the ductwork had always been there. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying your tenant is paying to heat a space he doesn't occupy by design?" She stammered something about building efficiency. I also showed the photos of the breaker feeding the basement and a written statement from the utility company confirming the usage discrepancy. The judge didn't even take 5 minutes. She ruled in my favor for full reimbursement of the 3 years overcharges, over $4,700, plus court fees and damages. When I went to collect the judgment, Martha tried to pay in installments. I refused. She eventually had to sell one of her properties to cover her legal debts, which I found deeply satisfying. I moved out the following month. My new apartment's gas bill, $65 a month. Electric, around $40. Imagine stealing electricity and heat for years, then pretending it's always been that way. Martha out here running a side hustle is an energy vampire. She literally had you heating her basement like it was a sauna membership. Watching her crumble under her own lies in court must have been delicious. $4,700 back and a landlord forced to sell property? What a revenge. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.